suggest the following because we received some very, very good questions. What I suggest that if you allow me, I will summarize the main questions and we will do the same order that we did the talks for the our panel to respond. And I will mention the major points that I saw in these conversations, and I hope I'm not discriminating against anyone, and everyone feels represented with their comments and questions. One set of questions regards the issue of the vaccine in all this context. Since there is an agreement of Israel being defined as an apartheid state, and therefore the anti-apartheid activity includes the boycott, divestment, and sanction, and any other means that were probably used also against apartheid South Africa. Here comes the complex question that both Yara and Richard and maybe Naim and Nida would like to respond as well. There are now conversations between Israel and Denmark and Israel and Norway on vaccine cooperation, so to speak, and our viewers from these countries are asking whether this kind of cooperation when it comes to an issue of medicine would be seen by you as part of an act of government that should be boycotted, should be sanctioned, should be criticized. There's kind of a fine line here between humane or medical help and the way it is politicized. It is weaponized in many ways in the struggle of Israel to legitimize itself, and can it be weaponized in the struggle to force apartheid Israel to change its way? So one set of questions is about the vaccine, and maybe Yara could also enlighten us a little bit about this more in detail. The other set of questions has to do with the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Of course, if we would like some of our listeners and viewers wanted you to comment on the ICC. How do you see its role? What are your hopes from this? Can you contextualize it in the wider struggle against apartheid in Israel? So that's a second point. A recurring issue came with, and I think this was triggered a little bit by Naim's remark about the Palestinian Authority. How much is it a legitimate part of the structure? And is there an alternative to the PA? Francesco Amaruso asks whether could it be maybe dismantled and replaced by direct rule of the occupier, or does it have any value, or at least temporary value, as Naim I think was trying to tell us? And we would like to hear also Richard views on the PA within this discussion on the legitimacy of the apartheid system on the one hand, and the various outfits that are struggling against it, and are there something in between which is both fighting against the apartheid but may unintentionally or knowingly even be part of that apartheid system? So if you could say something about that as well. About Kashmir, maybe we can hear a little bit more about possible cooperation between the struggle in Kashmir and the struggle in Palestine. That would be very useful, I think, if we can hear more. Two final points for you to consider. One, I don't know if you have the answer, maybe Yara does. I have a partial answer for Talal, who were the first Palestinians to mention apartheid. I know that in general, the PLO Research Center in Beirut that was established in 1964 and was very prolific in terms of publications and so on, definitely referred to Israel as a settler colonial state in 1964 already. And with it also compared it to apartheid South Africa. But we can check the names, or maybe Yara would know the names directly. And finally, we have a question from Judith in Germany about is there a tension between a discourse of human rights and a discourse of civil rights? Is there a preference for any of them when we struggle against an ongoing apartheid system that we would all like to dismantling? And in many ways, if you can also refer in your response to, because there were 2-3 questions about it, is it possible to dismantle, in your view, such an ongoing apartheid that has been sustained by international legitimacy and so on? Something like, something maybe to leave us with a more optimistic view with regard to the liberation of Palestine and the restoration of justice to Palestine and the Palestinians. So this is more or less, I know that you could also see the chat yourself, so if you want to respond to something else, please do. Yara, would you mind be the first, take the round again, begin the round again?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll just start very briefly with a comment on the ICC, and perhaps not spend too long on it because I'm not a law expert. Now, of course, we saw sort of what was described by a lot of human rights groups wins with the ICC, particularly because they decided, the Office of the Prosecutor decided that they did have jurisdiction, and then they announced that they would be pursuing that investigation. And in general, I'm pessimistic with the ICC investigation, particularly because of the institution itself and its precedence for being really a place only to challenge African regimes, but also because of the mechanisms. Now, it's very likely that there will be a lot of barriers in place because there is a new prosecutor, and the new prosecutor is said to be Israel friendly. But also the mechanisms which allows for allows for Israel to conduct investigations into war crimes domestically. And we know from precedents with a recent case with the British, who were accused of war crimes in Iraq and then Afghanistan, that the British domestic investigations into war crimes in Iraq amounted to naught. And we all know, of course, that British war crimes in Iraq have been extensively documented. And to have that case closed was incredibly depressing, not only for Iraq and their pursuit of justice, but also, as I said, that legal precedence for what might happen with the Palestinian case. Now, onto vaccines, which I think is something that I'm sort of more familiar with. You know, the Israeli narrative, the Israeli regime narrative is that it has every right to vaccinate its citizens first and then think about, you know, others. And it really pushes this narrative of the idea of this border between Israel and Palestine. And of course, we know that there isn't a border. Israel exists as a sovereign entity from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. It has actually never officially declared its borders so that it can maintain its expansionist, expansionist agenda. And moreover, under international law, as Ilan, you said that, you know, there's an agreement about Israel being apartheid. There isn't an agreement. I mean, among us, there is an agreement, but among the international community, there is an agreement.
I meant between us.
Yeah. Okay. But among the international community, there is international consensus, and it's recognized under international law that Israel is an occupying power. And as said occupying power, it has a legal responsibility to vaccinate those that it occupies. And it includes includes the Geneva Convention, actually includes specifically pandemics, that the occupying power has to provide adequate healthcare during such times. Now, we know that it hasn't. It has pursued this narrative of, we're allowing a few thousand doses here and there out of the goodness of our heart. Meanwhile, it's acting like the regional dealer for the vaccine. Israel is, it's really, really disgusting what it's doing. It has a surplus supply of vaccines, and rather than vaccinate the Palestinian population, which is an incredibly vulnerable population already because of what Israel has systematically done to its healthcare system over the many decades, it is actually making deals with other countries in order to provide the vaccine. And those countries are also complicit because indeed, as third state parties, they need to insist that Israel provides the vaccine to the Palestinians. But these are desperate times, and countries are so desperate to get back to what they call normal that, even in the best of times, they ignore international law when it comes to Palestine. But even in these times when they're desperate, they will happily, make deals with Israel to ensure that its own population is vaccinated. And then on to, perhaps I'll just address this as a final point, particularly Francesco's question about the PA, or rather the Palestinian leadership in general. There aren't major calls amongst Palestinian society, particularly in the West Bank and Gaza, for the dismantlement of the PA. And I think there are two main reasons for that. The first reason is that it's an incredibly oppressive, politically oppressive environment in the West Bank and Gaza. Both the ruling authorities crack down on political opposition in quite a harsh way. This includes the arrest of activists, the arrest of journalists, those who criticize the Palestinian president. Those who do call for the dismantlement of the PA are often harassed, threatened, sometimes arrested and tortured. So the situation is an incredibly repressive one politically. But secondly, also because there isn't an alternative, and I think that's important. The Palestinian Authority is not the representative of the Palestinian people. It's a service provider. It was created by the Oslo Accords and has since come to employ hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. And so the real fear is that, if there is a dismantlement of the PA, what happens to those services? What happens to those jobs? When I'm talking about those jobs, I'm talking about those who work in ministries, who work in municipalities, who, teachers, they're all employed by the PA. And so that's not to say that in general people see the PA as an incredibly corrupt body, as a subcontractor for the Israeli occupation. But I think that sort of combination of the repressive political environment and also the lack of an alternative means that there are mass calls for its dismantlement. And I think in terms of the PA's dismantlement, the Palestinian Authority's dismantlement, if it were to happen, it has to happen in a very structured and responsible way to mitigate, the worst effects that it would have on mainly workers. And that's not to sort of pander around it. I personally think the Palestinian Authority should be dismantled, but it has to happen in that responsible way. And all of this is incredibly important in the political context, which we know is that of upcoming Palestinian elections, or maybe. In recent weeks, actually, there is a lot of pundits are saying that it might not happen. The Palestinian elections are for multiple different bodies. There's the Palestinian Legislative Council elections, the president elections, the presidential elections, and then also apparently the Palestinian National Council elections. Now, these elections are taking place in a very repressive environment, but it's again, we're yet to see whether they'll actually happen. And now the West Bank is under a renewed lockdown. This also, I don't think is by chance. I think it also serves the authorities very well that there is a lockdown. It restricts people's capacities to mobilize politically. So I'll stop there because I've talked for a while and I know I haven't answered that last question as much as I could, but I know Francesco and we can have talks about this another time.
Yeah, sure you can. Thank you so much. I think the second speaker was Naeem, and just before I turn to him and hear his comments, I think the whole weaponization of the COVID of the vaccine reminds me when I started to be involved in the solidarity movement against apartheid South Africa. We were told by official spokesperson of the apartheid state, but did you know that South Africa invented all kinds of medical things like the MRI, transplanted the hearts, and so on. And this was used as a kind of an excuse to say that because we have these contributions to medicine and science, you cannot allow yourself to boycott us or to call for our boycott. And I think that this is a very cynical, very dangerous, dehumanized way, of course, to try and deal with these real issues of health and welfare in order to provide immunity for an ongoing criminal policy. So Naeem, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilan. I'll try to get through these quickly. All the questions around the PA, I think Yara addressed the questions as well as the dilemma about it quite well, so I'm not going to speak about that. There was a question about vision of the anti-apartheid forces in South Africa, and that might be missing in the Palestinian context. And what I thought about the vision of a single federal state as expressed in Omri Bom's book. I haven't read his book, so I can't comment about it. But let me just comment about the issue of vision and also strategy and tactics. This, in a sense, a response to what Richard Falk said about international solidarity being the main factor in ending apartheid in South Africa. This issue of vision, I think, is a very important one. I mean, in the South African context, as I said, we had a number of different sections of the liberation movement, different ideologically, different strategically, different in terms of their strategies and tactics. And at some points in time, within the country, certainly, we were fighting against each other. But the one thing that we can say is that there was a sense of a common vision. And the question then, the person who posed the question is there such a common vision among all Palestinians? And it seems from the outside meaning someone who's not a Palestinian, that is not the case. That you can ask different Palestinians about what their vision would be, and you might get different responses to that. And I think it's an important question. Personally, of course, I think that Palestinians need to decide for themselves what their vision is. But personally, the notion of a federal state is very questionable to me. On the strategy and tactics issue, Richard, just to say that I know that particularly now, and I think all of us on the panel here support very strongly the BDS campaign, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions campaign. And I know that as we prosecute that campaign, that we often compare to the South African anti-apartheid movement globally and what we used to call the sanctions campaign. It's an important comparison because the sanctions campaign had very important effects on South Africa and on the South African economy, so that, by the end of the 1980s, the South African government wasn't able even to guarantee its fiscus for a full month. That's how serious it was. But the international isolation campaign against South Africa firstly wasn't the only and most important factor in bringing down the apartheid state. And secondly, in itself could not have become as significant as it had been were it not for the internal resistance within South Africa. And this is something that is often ignored. The growing resistance, the calls in the 80s, for example, to make South Africa ungovernable, which was exactly what the call was, make South Africa ungovernable. The fact that we had within South Africa certain townships that had become no-go areas for the South African Defense Force, all of this contributed to making apartheid unworkable. And the international campaign fed off the resistance within South Africa. And I'm making this point because in the Palestinian context, it's important for us who are outside to understand that as much as we support a BDS campaign, that we should equally support the resistance by Palestinians, from Palestinians within Palestine. And finally, let me just say, I don't know who the first Palestinians were to mention apartheid, but my sense of the first kind of scholarly work to deal with Israel as an apartheid state is that it was Uri Davis. And this was the book I mentioned earlier on from 1987.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Naeem. Nida, would you like to come in and give some response? Thank you.
Yeah. I think about vaccine and ICC, Yara covered most of the things. What I intend to talk of is that Kashmir question that you raised. Uh, I think for whatever we are looking from PDS model in Palestine, apart from the international pressure, international attention at the Kashmir, there has to be a decent degree of talk within in the mainland India, and that is missing in the civil society. Uh, so, like for the left, global left politics, the global left politics, the title, I think that's the title of Mark Lamont's Hill's book, any except Palestine. So is the situation in India, except Kashmir. We can talk about everything but Kashmir. So there has to be a decent discourse around Kashmir and what is happening, which is sadly missing at the moment. And then the last, and I'd like to, I think the other questions, there are people better qualified than me to answer, but there is this question about the discourse between human rights and the civil rights, which I would like to talk of. I don't think that they could be separated. It's necessary to have civil rights in order to argue, in order to draw attention to the human rights violations and things, uh, human rights violations. Like in India, the civil rights, the condition of the civil rights have degenerated dramatically over the years, and that may be the one of the reasons that we cannot mobilize, we cannot draw attention to what is happening in Kashmir, to what happened in Delhi in 2020. Civil rights and also civil liberties. And most important of them is the right to freedom of speech and expression. As I said, the first domain of resistance, and it's getting remarkably curtailed. So that's one of the things around which I think it's tied up. You can't build a resistance without civil rights, without civil liberties, and you can't draw attention to human rights violations which are happening at other places. So yeah, that's all.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for your important and excellent contribution. Richard, would you like to conclude for us the discussion, but also relate to some of the question? And before you do, there was a kind of a follow-up question about the vaccine that you I think are best there to answer. There is a kind of an argument that the Oslo Accords trump the Geneva Convention in the context of the vaccination. If you could kind of also tell us a little bit about the relationship between an agreement such in Oslo and the obligations under the Geneva Convention, especially in the context, for instance, of the vaccine crisis. Thank you. Richard, you have to unmute yourself. Richard, sorry. You have to unmute yourself and start from the beginning. Ah, there you are. Good. Oh, no, you're not, you're still muted. I'm sorry. Oh,
Remuted.
now you are. Thank you.
Okay. I want to start by saying that I didn't mean to convey the impression that Palestinian resistance was not complementary and primary in the context of an effective struggle against the apartheid regime in Israel. And it's only the leadership and inspiration derived from that Palestinian resistance that the global solidarity movement gained strength and relevance. And so if I was misleading in the way I put it, I apologize for that. And secondly, I wanted to address a little bit the response that Yara made to the ICC decision. And I understand fully her pessimism on the level of substance. It's very unlikely that any Israeli will face prosecution, partly because of political issues, partly because of the logistical difficulties of collecting evidence in a hostile Israeli environment, and partly because of the opportunity Israel has to delay and distract by conducting a formalistic investigation of its own, which would disable the ICC process. And again, and also the new prosecutor may very well minimize the role, although I think he will be under a lot of pressure to maintain the investigation in some form. And of course, we should remember it includes allegations against Hamas as well as against Israel. But the importance of the decision, and it is, in my view, a huge victory for the Palestinian struggle, even if nothing more happens, is that it casts a searchlight on the criminality of the way in which Israel has used its role as occupying power and its control over force and its violations of the Geneva Convention. It creates a extremely strong incentive for a more robust global solidarity initiative. And these kind of outcomes in what I was calling symbolic politics have a far greater impact on civil society and public opinion than they do on governmental policy and governmental action. And we remain, I think, too focused on these substantive limitations of international institutions, including the UN itself. It's very important symbolically in terms of legitimating and delegitimating certain forms of behavior, but it's helpless to override geopolitical opposition. And in the Israeli context, the US role has been a guardian of Israeli criminality. And that really demobilizes or disempowers international institutions from implementing their decisions in the symbolic realm. But one shouldn't underestimate, despite that, those decisions have an extreme importance. And as I was trying to suggest, if you look at the historic record of how conflicts were resolved in the last 75 years, it was not by the balance of forces measured militarily. It was by the side that prevailed on the symbolic level of law, morality, I would say spirituality, and public opinion and discourse. As far as the vaccine is concerned and the relationship it has, that kind of behavior that has prevented the Palestinians from receiving medical treatment in accordance with the health obligations of an occupying power that are outlined in the Fourth Geneva Convention, there's no question that that obligation takes precedence over anything that is read into the Oslo diplomacy and the agreements that emerged out of it, because that agreement that constitutes the Geneva Convention is an international treaty of the highest status that, even if a country isn't a party, has a binding it's obligatory for every state. And in the case of Israel in particular, in Palestine, which always has had a special connection with the United Nations because of the history of how the UN gave rise to the whole notion of partitioning historic Palestine and took responsibility. There's an added dimension of accountability. And as I've tried to say, this has been affirmed over and over again in resolutions of the General Assembly, overwhelmingly supported, but also even in the Security Council to a substantial degree. And it's only the geopolitical resistance that makes this ineffectual on a behavioral level. And that is something that's regrettable, but it's not the whole story. And as with other aspects of these issues, including the ICC decision, what Israel is doing with respect to its vaccine diplomacy and its withholding of its responsibilities to the Palestinians living in the occupied territories reinforces the image of a colonial, racist, apartheid structure of obligation. And again, I think will strengthen both the resolve to resist and the incentives of the solidarity movement to escalate its activities. Let me just say one word about the dynamics of dismantling. My view is that at some point, if this struggle is carried on effectively against apartheid, internally and internationally, it will lead a substantial part of the Israeli elite to recalculate their interests. That's what happened in South Africa. It wasn't a moral change of heart, sudden awakening to the immorality of the kind of racism practiced. It was that they would be better off living in a constitutional democracy than a multiracial constitutional democracy where they would be a relatively small minority, then they would be in having a pariah status internationally and being subject to sanctions and all kinds of pressures that were exerted from outside. And I see that as a not unrealistic scenario for the future of the Palestinian struggle. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you all, the great panelists we had today, Yara, Naim, Fida, and Richard. I'm taking some encouragement from Richard's final words about the possibilities that even eventually, at least part of the Israeli lead would recalculate, not for moral reasons, of course, but for practical assessment that there is no other way forward. Until then, of course, we will hang on to the importance of political symbolism, of solidarity with the Palestinian people, using some of the methods of the solidarity movement against apartheid, using such boycotts, sanctions, and so on. And we will continue to inform people. I agree with Yara that we are the ones who agree on Israel as an apartheid state, but we are far from having a consensus in the Western academia, media, and mainstream politics about it. But at the same time, I think the whole question of dismantling apartheid, decolonizing a state in the 21st century are issues where academia, activism, and politics and social movements can work together and help those who would lead and eventually take the liberation struggle forward, which are the Palestinians and nobody else. So I hope you all found it as informative, as interesting, and as important as I did. This outfit that organized this conversation had organized a conversation before on Christian Zionism, and will continue to try and bring issues like that to a wider audience beyond the West, to Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, Australia, and of course, anyone else who's interested. And as a director of the European Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter, I'm very happy that we are part of this outfit. And we will have a recording of this conversation and panel. And we hope to see you all in our next project. And we will keep you informed. Special thanks to Ranjan and Kim for taking time to help in organizing this, and Hassanal and Chandar of Muzaffar from Just, who are all encouraging us and inspiring us to continue our struggle for justice, reconciliation, and peace. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day, the afternoon, the night, the dawn, the sunset. I know we have time zones for every hour in the day today that you are in different parts of the world. So enjoy that, whatever is left of the day or what is waiting for you tomorrow. And we all hope to see a free, liberated, and democratic Palestine unfolding in the near future rather than the distant future. Thank you very much.